10 shocking soccer moments that never happened before. If you think the 7-1 win from Germany over Brazil in 2014 or Ibrahimovic's overhead kick were once-in-a-lifetime moments in soccer, you haven't seen this footage yet. Today, we're going to show you events that are even more improbable than those just mentioned. And secondly, will probably never ever happen again. Included are freaky fails that you couldn't even imagine in your wildest dreams, forces of nature that destroyed entire stadiums during a game, and even professionals who seem to have absolutely inhuman strength. It's going to be really exciting, so stay tuned here at Wonderlane. On number 10, we start directly with the 2016 European Championship final in Paris. However, we don't talk about the fact that Portugal became the European soccer champion in a dramatic overtime, but instead about a mistake that was so stupid in the eyes of many that it probably wouldn't have even been believed if it hadn't been captured by thousands of cameras. Anyone who followed the match between the tournament hosts, France, and the Portuguese very closely quickly realized that something was wrong with the game. The entire stadium was full of gigantic moths that not only constantly flew through the picture, but also spread out on the players when they were on the ground. To the question of why there were tens of thousands of moths in the stadium during this match of all matches, there's actually a very simple answer. The janitors of the stadium in Paris forgot to turn off the lights in the arena the night before the final. And since the stadium is an open-air stadium, it attracted countless moths overnight, which then extremely disturbed not only the players, but also the thousands of fans on site during the final. On number 9, we continue with an event that actually occurs quite often in soccer. But this time, it was so extraordinary that it will probably never be repeated again. This is probably the most unintentional own goal of all time. Although most own goals happen unplanned, what happened to this amateur team a few years ago is truly amazing. The two teams were playing in such a strong wind that a player who actually wanted to clear the ball at the halfway line scored what was probably the most blatant own goal ever. From over 40 meters, the ball was steered against the direction of the shot by the wind to his own goal, so that in the end, even the goalkeeper had no chance. Next, on number 8, we travel to Tanzania, where the following happened during a game a few years ago. Out of nowhere, all of the players dropped down as if they were frozen and remained lying on the ground. For the TV viewer, it became even more curious shortly afterwards, when the players suddenly began to flee from the field. At first, it was not immediately clear why the 22 professionals were behaving so strangely. So, what had happened? Out of nowhere, and with absolutely no warning, the entire stadium was attacked by a gigantic swarm of bees that hunted down everything that couldn't get to safety quickly enough. In fact, such bee infestations are commonplace in Tanzania, which is why most of the players and spectators initially lay flat on the ground to cover as much of their body and thus attack surface as possible. On one hand, the players' behavior was more than understandable. But on the other hand, we have never seen so many soccer matches that had to be stopped because of an insect attack. For number 7, we'll stick with a beastly action that, in this case, was a curse for one team and a blessing for the other. Many years ago, when two teams from the 3rd Argentine League were playing for promotion, the team in the blue jerseys was already looking forward to scoring the 4th goal. But out of nowhere, the unbelievable happened, and the team in red was struck by a true miracle. Without warning, a dog from the fan block made it onto the pitch and ran along in front of the goal at exactly the right moment. That the dog is man's best friend is definitely true in this case, even if it only applies to the team in red. Let's continue with a game that was supposed to start normally, but ended in absolute disaster before kickoff. While everyone was initially looking forward to a good match in Bolivia 2021, these hopes were buried even before the side was selected. Without warning, the field was suddenly swept away by a tornado that swept away everything that wasn't nailed down. Not only was the entire field shaken, but some players were also stripped of their jackets. Fortunately, no one was injured in the incident, but all the players probably experienced a fair amount of shock. Next up is the Dutch League, where an accident occurred in the stadium of NEC Nijmegen 2021 that should never have happened, as it would have resulted in serious consequences for the health of dozens of people in the worst case. After the visiting team from Vitesse had won the match and wanted to celebrate with the fans, something happened that nobody had expected. As the visiting fans jumped up and down in the stands singing victory chants, a part of the stands suddenly collapsed and fell down a few meters. What was initially a shock, fortunately, turned out to be harmless shortly afterwards, as all the fans remained unharmed. When the players on the pitch noticed this, they were not only very relieved, they even continued to party shortly afterwards, as they now had 2 reasons to celebrate. Why the Tribune was so unstable, however, is still not entirely clear. Much more extreme in comparison was what happened in 2010 at the Metrodome Stadium in Minneapolis. At the time, the Metrodome was one of the most modern and prestigious multi-purpose stadiums, hosting a wide variety of sporting events and providing space for up to 64,000 football fans. Until December 11, 2010, when a catastrophe occurred in the Metrodome, which fortunately did not involve any people, but caused damage from which the operators had a hard time recovering. The roof of the stadium collapsed unexpectedly. The reason for this was that a layer of snow that was several meters thick had been collecting on the roof for days, and at some point, it became so heavy that it caused the stadium to collapse. While such extreme snowfalls are actually not uncommon in the region, for most people, it was very shocking how quickly the stadium would fall victim to the load. For number 3, we'll stick to football, and a player who seems to have too much power for the sport. We're talking about American star Jimmy Graham, who was under contract with the New Orleans Saints until 2014. There, he had a reputation not only as a fast player, but also as a particularly powerful one. He proved this reputation particularly strongly in 2014 when, after scoring a touchdown, he hung on to what was actually a very sturdy and heavy goalpost. Completely unexpectedly, however, the rods collapsed under this load, which meant that the game had to be interrupted for a long time. Graham, who incidentally had to pay a $30,000 fine for this, is not the first person to pull off such a feat, however. Months earlier, these fans partied so hard that they collapsed the goalposts on a football field in the heat of the moment. Next, we come to an incident that is not only incredibly unlikely, but unfortunately, also extremely dangerous. The probability of being struck by lightning is approximately 1 in 6 million during a thunderstorm. Accordingly, it's even more improbable if this misfortune happens to you while you are playing soccer. But these 2 players were not particularly lucky this day, when they were actually struck by lightning on the pitch at the same time in 2010. At this point, we can only hope that nothing worse happened to these 2 players. After all, they've definitely had the fright of their lives. At number 1, we now have another fail from the first Japanese league that this player is unlikely to do again. It's about the Brazilian Anderson Lopez, who scored an important goal in an away game in 2019. To celebrate this appropriately, he then ran in the direction of the visiting fans, thinking he only had to jump over the rail for a moment to do so. However, he was not aware that there is a ditch in the stadium behind the barrier, which is not only several meters deep, but also equipped with bare cement. It came as it had to come, and Lopez jumped over the boards in all exuberance, only to land extremely hard shortly afterwards. While his teammates initially wondered where Lopez had got to, shortly afterwards, they found him writhing in pain on the concrete of the ditch and having to be treated by paramedics. Although he was only slightly injured in the action, he will probably never jump over a rail to cheer again. And that's it for our video. Feel free to let us know in the comments which moment you found the most awesome. Otherwise, like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to Wonderlane for more exciting content. See you next time, here at Wonderlane.